Fortunate to have two presenters with us today who bring complementary perspectives on disaster response, emergency management, and the arts and cultural sector. First, I'm pleased to introduce Tyga Christie. Tyga is a co-director of Fault Line Ensemble, a swiftwater rope rescue technician with the Rescue Inc. Technical Rescue Team, and serves as a regional coordinator with Vermont Emergency Management. Tyga brings extensive experience in technical rescue and emergency management, well as firsthand understanding of the systems and partnerships that are essential when communities are responding to disasters. And we're pleased to also welcome Amy Cunningham, Deputy Director of the Vermont Arts Council. Amy brings perspective of the State Arts Agency and has been closely involved in Vermont's efforts to build stronger connection between the arts and culture sector and emergency preparedness and response systems. Together, Tyga and Amy will help us look at disaster resilience from both the emergency management and arts and cultural perspectives, and importantly, at what becomes possible when those two sectors work well together. Tyga and Amy, thank you both for joining us today. I'm going to turn things over to you. Take it away.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for having us. Great to see you all. Today we're going to talk about VACDaRN, which is a mouthful of an acronym, but really what we're going to talk about is network building as resilience and art as an important component of disaster recovery and resilience. And I'm so pleased to be joined by Tyga. She's been a crucial partner in VACDaRN work. She's coming to this as, emergency management professional, health worker, representing the Vermont Emergency Management on our VACDaRN steering team, but also as a theater artist who's using theater to build community resiliency. So thanks again, Tyga, for being here. I want to acknowledge our friend and partner in crime, Rachel Onoff, who's the director of the Vermont Historical Records Program with the State Archives. She's been a big part of the formation and leadership of this network. She was hoping to be here, but had a family emergency that kept her away today. So she sends her regrets. Want to share a little bit of context about Vermont. As you may know, is an entirely rural state. Our cultural organizations are small, geographically dispersed, operating with really limited capacity. Our state has a total population size that's smaller than most major cities. We've got about as many people as Louisville, Kentucky. So that definitely factors into the approach that we've taken in developing this network. And I also want to just lift up that so many of you live and work in states that have experienced monumental disasters. And I know that many of your agencies have played and continue to play really critical roles in preparedness and response and recovery. So I'm really interested to hear from those of you who've been through these experiences yourselves, and hoping that you'll feel free to add your reflections in the chat as we talk, and then there'll be time and encourage you to share your experiences during that discussion period at the end. And I'm going to share some slides. Here we go. You seeing that header slide okay, Eric? That's what you're supposed to see, right?
That looks good.
All right. So before I tell you more about Vermont, let's just start and just get a sense of where everyone is starting from. If a major disaster hit your state tomorrow, how confident are you that your state's cultural organizations and artists would know where to turn for help? So just a quick gut check. No right answer here. I'm sure there's quite a range of experiences. I'm going to give it just another little bit. All right, it looks like we've got a good range of responses here. So I'm going to end the poll and share results just so folks can see. Like I said, there's no right or answer. I know there's a real range of experiences. This is really the question that VACDaRN grew out of. And it's really our realization that Vermont had a lot of expertise and resources, but they weren't necessarily connected in a way that made them easy to access during a crisis. So I will stop sharing that. And I think it's going to go back to the slide. Is that what you're seeing? Yeah. So disaster preparedness, I'm going to be a little bit of a broken record when I say that disaster preparedness isn't just about the plans, the supplies, and the policies. It's about who knows what, who can help. Like I said, one of the things we realized in Vermont was that we actually had a tremendous amount of experience. We had archivists who knew about collections, great emergency managers who understood response systems, arts organizations who knew their communities, conservators who knew how to salvage materials. We had relationships, informal relationships throughout these sectors, but all those pieces weren't necessarily connected. So the problem wasn't necessarily about a lack of expertise, it was about that lack of intentional connection. VACDaRN didn't begin as a fully formed initiative. We started by bringing people together and asking, what would Vermont actually need? Who's already doing this work? Where are the gaps? That meant getting people in the same room who don't necessarily spend much time together. We received a performing arts readiness grant that was specifically for performing arts readiness groups. But we understood from the beginning that we wanted to cast a much wider net than that. So through 2018 to 2019, we began a period of listening and convening. We used the cultural placekeeping guide as the foundation to kind of guide us through how we were going to create the network. We were lucky to work with Mary Margaret Schoenfeld, who many of you may know, is an arts consultant who long ago was an Arts Council employee. So that grant helped us bring her in to do some really wonderful facilitation and convening. So just the point here is that we didn't start by designing a program. We started by asking who needed to be connected and represented. Whoops. All right. There we go. We deliberately wanted this to be bigger than arts. That cross-sector piece is really important for us. We wanted we didn't want to just create an arts disaster committee and invite an emergency manager to come to talk to us once a year. We wanted emergency management to be part of the network. We wanted cultural heritage professionals alongside performing arts organizations. We wanted state agencies alongside small rural historical societies, for example. That diversity of expertise is what we think makes the network really useful. This is one of the roles where I think state agencies can play a particularly important role. You know, the Arts Council doesn't need to become FEMA. We don't need to become emergency managers or conservators. We're looking to multiply connections rather than create a new bureaucracy. So we consider our steering team to be representatives of a network of networks. So we've got folks from the Department of Libraries, and I know every state is kind of organized a little bit differently, and in some cases you all may already work in one department, but the State Historical Society, who's got so many relationships with small historical societies and museums throughout the state. We've got our friends at Vermont Humanities. We've got folks from the Department of Libraries. The archive sits within the Secretary of State's office. So all of these people come to the steering team representing their own networks. So again, like I said, looking to multiply connections rather than create a new bureaucracy. I think we being state arts agencies, we're good at convening, connecting, communicating, and making sure the arts sector has a seat at the table. That was really our focus there in creating this steering team. One of the most important relationships we've developed is with Vermont Emergency Management. So again, VACDaRN's not seeking to become an emergency management agency. We need to make sure the cultural sector is connected to that system that already exists. So I'm going to turn it over to Tyga to talk about Vermont Emergency Management.
Thanks, Amy, and hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here, and thank you, Eric, for that link. Vermont Emergency Management is a team of roughly 30-ish people, which a lot of times when I go to more populous states, that's the number of people they have at the county level doing emergency management. We're a very small team for a very small state, and these kinds of partnerships with arts organizations, with local towns, with local nonprofits, social services are kind of what makes emergency management work in a small state that's low resource in terms of people in some ways. I came into emergency management from life as a performance artist. I still direct an ensemble, and that's a large part of my life. So I was thrilled to get involved with VACDaRN, and I think that that partnership has been a place where a lot of creativity has grown out of sort of the more traditional response to emergencies that VEM kind of uh, dives into when an incident happens. The arts and culture sector has really expanded our understanding of what is possible in rural Vermont. If we jump ahead in the slides, which I'm not sure I know how to do, but I know Amy knows how to do, I'm going to talk just really briefly about the planning structure in Vermont. There's a hierarchy that starts local and ends local, and in between, as a disaster or an incident or an emergency unfolds, as it gets larger and larger, if it outstrips those local resources, it goes kind of to the next highest level. And I don't know all of the systems of the states that you're coming from, but I imagine they're relatively similar. So just the quick overview is something happens, an emergency of some kind happens. That impacts your organization, the first response is going to be your organization, right? Or the arts organization that is impacted. It's going to be that entity's emergency plan. And if those resources are outstripped, then there's going to be a first response, probably through a 911 call from someone at that organization. If that first response, local fire rescue, police, is not able to manage the situation on their own, that's when the response is going to roll over to local emergency management plans crafted by the towns. And these vary hugely. If you're in a large city, there might be a very intricate emergency management plan. In some of my towns, there are a 5-page document that is very basic, that is run by a volunteer. So it depends a lot on the needs of the community and the infrastructure and capacity that's available. But some sort of local emergency management is going to kick in at the point that local first response gets overwhelmed because an incident is too large. And if the local emergency management is not able to fully resolve the emergency or the disaster in Vermont, because we don't have county government here, that rolls over to the state. In many of your states, county emergency management would step in at that point, but we skip that step here where we are. And eventually, if your county emergency management were to become overwhelmed, you would be moving up to state resources. And so the state emergency management plans are also something to be aware of, and what those plans look like, and how they impact your arts organizations potentially in your state. When an emergency gets to the state level, the State Emergency Operations Center is often activated, and that is an entity that brings together partners from across the state, often physically in one location or many locations in different counties, to work together to collaborate and address the ways that the disaster is impacting different sectors, and to pool resources to build situational awareness and to get resources where they need to go throughout the state. And then there's interstate emergency management compacts that I won't get into, but if something is large enough that the state doesn't have the resources on their own, there's mechanisms for bringing in resources from other states and from the federal government. If we jump ahead, I'll show you what the State Emergency Operations Center looks like in Vermont. This is the SEOC. Fun fact, this is during the beginning of COVID is when this photo was taken. So clearly we don't get everything right. A couple days after this, someone said, I don't think we should all be sitting here elbow to elbow. And it became a virtual space instead of a physical one. But the reason I'm sharing this with you is that the state response very heavily relies on gathering information from what is happening locally. And that is where a network like this, I think, can do a lot in that immediate aftermath, or even the ongoing, evolving incident. This group of people in this room, or perhaps multiple rooms in a larger state, is trying to maintain, you can see the large map on the wall, it's trying to build a situational awareness picture of what is happening, who is being impacted, and how. And that's something that arts organizations, I think, have the potential to be a huge asset in, because arts organizations know their communities in very unique ways that emergency management and first response often does not. So as the state is working on building that picture of what is happening and what resources are needed, building that really high overview. The local relationships that arts organizations build are in a position to contribute really key information that can help drive the response. I'm going to turn it back to you, Amy, but I'm happy to answer questions about emergency management kind of more generally.
That's great. Yeah, any questions for Tyga and what she just shared there? If not, I'll move into the next poll. Just want to get a sense, again, no right or wrong answers, just a point of reflection. Really interested for each of you to think about what partners your state arts agency currently has a meaningful relationship with around disaster preparedness or response. And this is a select all that applies. So take some time and think about your own networks and weigh in here. All right, thanks everybody. I'm going to share results. And you can see, I'm not sure if you can see the full list. Anything here surprise you or any reflections anyone wants to offer looking at this? Let's say that this is an exercise I would encourage anybody to do when you get home or when we're done with this webinar. You don't necessarily need every one of these relationships, but maybe it's a point of reflection on, what's the one person you need to know most before something happens.
Amy, can I jump in for one
Yeah,
just
please.
briefly? I'm not super surprised, but I'm sad to see less of a response around local emergency managers. Those are the people who are driving that local response and doing the planning for what that local response looks like. That's going to be the first kind of line of defense and response after that those public safety and first responders. And those conversations are having conversations with local emergency management and with first responders is the first thing that I recommend to arts organizations in Vermont. They're often very excited to hear from people who are thinking proactively about how an incident or an emergency might impact their organization, and also potentially about what they might be able to offer in terms of collaboration. So this is my plug for please have those conversations. Those are the folks I work with, and they're doing really good work, and it is only helpful to them to have more of a sense of who is in their community and what work is happening.
Awesome. Thank you for lifting that up, Tyga. It's a really great opportunity for folks to think about.
And Amy, can I jump in real quick too?
Please.
I'm looking at the poll. I think it looks like it's reflecting who state arts agencies work with in other areas.
Yeah.
Outside of emergency and disaster preparedness or response. So we're seeing people that they have other commonalities with really highlighted here, and less investment in those who they don't have day-to-day connections with.
I think that's an important point. And I think what that shows to me is that you're already set up to make these relationships happen. You already have these existing relationships. It's just about building them out a little bit more intentionally and then reaching out into that emergency management world too, right? To build that a little bit bigger tent. Totally. Right. All right. You're back at the slide deck. Sorry, I get unmoored by polls and slides at the same time. You can see my slides, right? So I want to talk a little bit about what VACDaRN actually does. We've kind of evolved around three primary functions: preparedness, response, and recovery. And I want to walk you through some of VACDaRN's approaches within each of these three steps, starting with preparedness. We've offered a number of different programs through the years to increase preparedness for the cultural community in Vermont. I have just a couple quick examples. The Culture for Climate Action was a workshop series that we did in partnership with UMass Amherst Arts Extension Service in 2024. A couple months of virtual workshops for cultural organizations, focused on the organizations that owned buildings. We talked about carbon mitigation, making climate resilience plans, evaluating your facility and operations, different sustainability and community engagement around climate resilience work. So that was in 2024. And then we've done two statewide day-long conferences. We did one in 2019 when we launched, and then of course COVID. Our most recent one was 2024. That was held in Barre, Vermont, which is one of the towns that was really ravaged by the 2023 floods. We had over 100 folks from, that whole tent I talked about, archivists sitting next to artists, sitting next to emergency planners. It was a really great mix of folks. We had sessions on emergency planning, event safety, equity and access, and emergency response. We did behind the scenes tours with the cultural organizations in that downtown to showcase their flood mitigation efforts. And of course, we integrated performances and storytelling and art making into that work as well, that day as well. Our most recent preparedness programming is this cohort that just wrapped up, the Resilient Cultural Organizations cohort. With some grant funding from the Water Wheel Foundation, we identified 11 cultural organizations around the state and worked with them to each create a disaster plan. So it was kind of professional development, coaching / mutual accountability. We used the D-Plan Arts Ready disaster resilience tool, and we worked through it together over the course of a year. We had 2 in-person meetings to kick it off, and then graduation, and then lots of virtual meetings in between, where we brought in folks like Tyga to really help with this. That's where Tyga gave her big plug on find your local emergency manager and meet them. Bringing in those kinds of resources to really help these cultural organizations hone and refine their disaster plans or continuity of operations plans. Oops, going backwards. So moving into the examples of response and recovery. We've activated for recovery a few times now. COVID was a primary example, but I want to share the flooding of 2023 as a primary example of some of the ways that VACDaRN worked on response and recovery efforts. So this is a picture of downtown Montpelier, the state capitol, just outside of the frame, beside that yellow house at 6 o'clock at the bottom of the screen. That is the house where the Vermont Arts Council was since 1965. That building was inundated and remains uninhabitable. So you can see the devastation that we experienced in this town. But this was a statewide event. Just in a nutshell, 2 months of rain in 2 days, 6 to 9 inches in many areas on top of already saturated ground, flash flooding, a lot of isolated rural communities and some of our cities affected, a series of landslides and evacuations all across the state. The day after, this is a picture of our colleague Rachel Onoff's road. She lives in a very rural community up high, and her road was washed out. In the meantime, I live kind of in downtown Montpelier, down low. My road was submerged. My backyard, borders the North Branch River. It was extensively flooded. So we were both stuck at home. We were stuck at home. Meanwhile, Tyga was like actually deployed as a real first responder. And I bring up those anecdotes just to share that one of the most important things we learn as being a part of this VACDaRN network is that we are not first responders. Tyga is a first responder. We are not first responders. And there is a real risk of getting in the way, not just physically, but in terms of communication in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. And so we kind of have that shared agreement with our steering team networks that despite our intentions to get out ahead of things and reach out immediately, there is value and purpose in taking a breath and waiting and coordinating our efforts and letting the most important priorities of human safety and that emergency response happen. So we were stuck at home while Tyga was out very busy as a part of a swiftwater rescue team. I want to acknowledge that day that how meaningful it was to have the calls of outreach and support from the state arts agency community. I think somebody from Kentucky's here. Kentucky Arts Council was among the first to reach out to us, and many of our other friends from around the country reach out and share resources and share sympathy and let us know that they were thinking about us, and that just was really meaningful. So thank you all for that. It's great to be a part of that national community. So in terms of moving into response, the value of having built these relationships ahead of time became very clear very quickly. And our lane, I think the disaster response for us isn't about everybody doing everything. It's about having people who know what their role is and knowing who else to call. So VACDaRN's lane during this response period, right, was that shared agreement among each other to wait and coordinate communications. You know, every statewide support organization wants to be out there communicating with their stakeholders, and for good reason. But if we take a beat and develop one resource list, so, you know, in other words, working with the Historical Society, working with the Department of Libraries, working with the Preservation Trust of Vermont, so that all of our outreach to the entire cultural sector, artists, performing arts organizations, libraries, historical societies, is consistent and accurate, and that we're sending one damage report tool. One thing I've seen in disasters, COVID, different flooding, is that everybody wants to get a sense of kind of damage reports from their particular stakeholders, and we agreed to work together and do one damage report tool. We worked with other state agencies like the Agency of Commerce and Community Development to make sure that like we had consistency of questions so that we could actually bring together the data and get a sense of what was happening around the state. Certainly there's time-sensitive factors around collection salvage, but besides that, it was really important for us to take a minute and agree to consolidate communications. So VACDaRN really were kind of focused on becoming the connective tissue. We weren't looking to deliver every service. We were helping to information and expertise to move through networks. And importantly, we were trying to help translate between the cultural sector and the emergency management system and other state agencies. In terms of response, like I said, part of our lane was collection salvage. So just two quick examples on that. The Vermont Studio Center is a world-class artist residency program with a large campus of historic and new buildings right on a big river in a very small town in northern Vermont. And many of their buildings were heavily impacted and damaged. A member of our steering team, who was an archivist, had a friend who saw on Facebook that the Studio Center was looking for volunteers to come help them get their print collection out of the basement. It had been completely flooded. And so Joseph immediately connected with Rachel, who immediately connected with the National Heritage Response Conservator, Carolyn Friesa, who's a member of our steering team. And she was able to call the executive director of that studio. You couldn't get there that day. She was able to talk to Hope, who's the executive director of the Studio Center, give her initial disaster response guidance and precautions around collections, And then another trained National Heritage Responder conservator, MJ Davis, who lives in that part of the state, was able to get there with some difficulty the next day to help the staff and help train those volunteers. They put that call out and people had answered in town and wanted to come help. And she was able to develop protocols to help them safely retrieve and stabilize those prints. Similarly, Stratford Historical Society, this is a different kind of cultural resource, very small historical society, hometown of Noah Khan, southern part of the state. Their collections, including films and photographs, were completely flooded, and a similar effort happened here. Rachel was able to, put the call out to the archivists and special collections and the conservators, coordinate with the folks at Dartmouth to train volunteers and work to stabilize these really tricky and fragile collections. Moving into recovery, helping to navigate public disaster assistance was something that VACDaRN tried to do, helping cultural organizations understand, what is assistance exists, who's eligible, how to document losses, how to navigate the system. Sure, it's no surprise to you all that federal disaster assistance can be incredibly confusing. And again, our role wasn't to become FEMA experts. It was to say, let's get the right people in the room and try to help translate this. And I'll confess, this was hard. And I don't have a magic bullet for navigating that disaster, those federal disaster efforts. I know a lot of you have experience with that as well. Another component, this was a more comfortable lane for the Arts Council, right? We're grant makers. We know how to do this part. We worked in collaboration with other key funders around the state, pulled together over $600,000 in recovery funding. We were able to coordinate and create separate lanes so that we weren't duplicating efforts, right? So we ran the grant programs for individual artists and for some of those conservation projects, some of those examples we talked about earlier. Vermont Humanities was able to get funding from the NEH and private money, and they ran the grant programs for the arts and cultural organizations that were damaged. Vermont Community Foundation was doing an enormous amount of relief funding across all sectors all over the state, and they focused some of their funding to support some really meaningful arts and community recovery projects. And again, they were able to come to VACDaRN and say, like, okay, who needs support? Where can we help within the arts and cultural sector? And I'll just tell you this quick story, a little silver lining in the chaos of our statewide flooding. Our building, as I mentioned, the headquarters of the Vermont Arts Council since 1965, is a beautiful historic house. It was the childhood home of Patrick Leahy. It's part of the state capitol complex, and it was inundated. Beside that building is a sculpture garden that we curate, and we had recently installed a show called Elements of Shelter, which was fittingly about the themes of climate change and housing. And so as soon as it was safe to do so, we went down to those grounds. We knew our building was wrecked, but we were really concerned about those sculptures outside. And most of them were fine, and two of them we couldn't find. And so we had pictures of those two pieces of art. We sent them out. Again, we already have these relationships with folks in different state agencies. We emailed our friends at Buildings and General Services, State Historic Preservation, the VACDaRN steering team. We just said, hey, here's two pictures of these sculptures. We know you have other fish to fry, many other things you have on your plate, but if you happen to see something that looks like this in a debris pile, let us know. And that, I think about 24 hours later, I was on my neighbor's back deck after having spent a day trying to help in downtown Montpelier, pulling off my muck boots, opened up a beer, and I get a text from the State Historic Preservation Officer who says, sends a picture and says, hey, is this yours? And it was a picture of this bench that you see on the left side. It's called Rinse and Repeat by the artist John O. Landsman. And it was over a mile away, jacked up on a guardrail between the Winooski River and Route 2. And I said, yes, that's ours. And our primary concern at the time was that the debris was going to be cleaned up quickly. And I was tired and flustered, and all the people I knew who had trucks were busy doing other things. So the best thing I could think of to do was tag it in some way so that someone, whoever's coming through to clean up the debris, would know. So that's my poor attempt at a sign. I had spray paint and a trash bag, and my intention was to go down there, duct tape this bag onto the sculpture so that when they came through to clear this debris out, it was just intermingled amongst trash cans and people's front porch steps, that they would know that this is to be saved. I had another bag that had my phone number on it. Anyway, get down there. It was totally unsafe for me to get out. There was no shoulder. There was a lot of traffic. It was on a curve. So I go to my friends, think about who do I know that lives the closest to where this sculpture is. And that's my friend Ben, who's in that picture on the right. Ben used to work for the Arts Council. He's currently the CEO of the Preservation Trust of Vermont. Called him up and said, it's an arts emergency. Pulled up in his driveway. He and his son, Sal, there on the left, got in the car. We went down there with the intention of trying to manage traffic so that we could put this bag on the sculpture. Once we get down there, Ben looks at it and says, I got a guy with a truck. This will fit in a truck. And so he called his neighbor Dan, and Dan came and helped us get the sculpture. And here we are returning it back to its grounds. And while we were returning it back to a place, we actually found the second sculpture that had disappeared in the flooding. It had gotten caught in the shrubbery around the building. So sometimes disaster response looks like formal systems, and sometimes it looks like a guy with a truck. But the common denominator is just pre-existing relationships and knowing who to call. In addition to helping the sector prepare and respond, VACDaRN's really interested in those ways that arts and culture can contribute to recovery efforts in meaningful ways, right? Community healing, connection, meaning making, rebuilding community identity. And I'm going to turn it back over to Taiga to talk about her work in that realm.
Thanks. First off, I love this photo from the Main Street in Montpelier. But I came to Vermont Emergency Management and came to VACDaRN with a background in directing an ensemble of artists and health workers. And our biggest project right now, we can jump ahead one, is a performance called Counting Pebbles, which tours to rural ambulance stations and tells a fictional story that is mostly adapted from interviews about vicarious trauma and mental health struggles in EMTs and paramedics. And so we have been, in my kind of non-emergency management work, we have been working on how to use performing arts for trauma recovery. And I started to talk about this a bit during my early days at Vermont Emergency Management, and then the floods hit, and we do an annual conference. And I have started folding in storytelling with the support of Amy and Rachel and several other collaborators, folding in storytelling and recovery somewhere into these annual conferences, which generally happen in September, are 3 years of major flooding, 2 years of major flooding, and then 1 year of less major have happened, all of them in July. All of them also on the same day in July. July 10th is a day in Vermont now. But then we get to September, and people have been working really, really hard for a long time. And in Vermont, most of them are volunteers, and people have, as you heard from Amy, lost, had damage to personal property, damage to town property, damage to families and neighbors and communities, many aspects of the community that they know. And then we gather them in September. And what I've found is that emergency management and first response have not been told what happened to you, or have not been asked what happened to you during this. I started out by asking, and we can jump ahead one more, just asking that very simple question in a basic storytelling workshop that was held during one of these conference sessions: what is your strongest memory from the floods? And telling people turn to the person next to you and exchange your strongest, the thing that jumps out in your memory from the floods. And the room just exploded. And it was like people had not been asked these questions and not had space to reflect, not in space to share those experiences because they've just been going back to back, and then turning around and going to their actual job for the day and then going back to recovery work. So we've slowly started to integrate storytelling, story slams, storytelling workshops into the emergency management world little by little. And there's always someone who says, "What is this doing in emergency management? Like this doesn't belong at an emergency management conference." And there are always more people who say, "Oh, that I'm so glad this was here." So, um, and I think it raises a different kind of awareness of how the arts sector is relevant to emergency management and recovery. Another parallel that we've drawn is doing some event safety planning, modeling, and work and education at the state level through state emergency management. That was kind of helped along because we had the eclipse event in 2024. And that was a good excuse to be talking about event safety because we had so many people fled into the state to be in the path of totality for the eclipse. And so there was a moment when that conversation, the like value of that conversation was very clear. And we've been able, with VACDaRN's collaboration and VEM's collaboration, to kind of keep that conversation going in a few different ways since then. We also, at the day of one of the days of learning that Amy mentioned, we brought the Story Slam model that we had done at the emergency management conference, I think a week before, maybe 2 weeks before at most. We turned around and brought that also to the day of learning. And that was really interesting to see the kind of two sides of that collaboration interact with that same model of storytelling as flood recovery. And I think there's a lot here, I think, in teaching our like very, in some ways strict and regimented, and in some ways very traditional field of emergency management and first response. Just that little bit of mind opening to think about how arts and culture and storytelling can integrate into and make the work more effective at the state level. So I hope eventually to have an arts and culture representative partner in the state emergency management, in the state emergency operations center, in those conversations very centrally. And until then, I think this kind of exchange back and forth of lessons learned and strategies and tactics has been really fruitful.
Awesome. Thank you, Taiga. So just wrapping up some lessons learned. Don't build more silos. Make sure arts and culture are part of the systems that already exist. Relationships take time. This is my new favorite quote. I borrowed it from Taiga, who I think borrowed it from another coworker. A storm is not the time to be exchanging business cards, right? Build those relationships in advance. The rural considerations that we've talked about, small organizations, limited capacity, often spread out. Making preparedness doable. Small steps are better than an elaborate plan that never gets finished. And that there's a lot of value in doing that work together. Many hands make light work. And then finally, letting the network evolve. The needs change, stay flexible so that the network can change with them. I'll wrap with a closing question. This isn't a poll, but I just wanted to leave this with you. And hope you take this with you today, invitation to kind of think about your state's own existing formal and informal networks and identifying, just what's one new relationship that you think would help increase disaster resilience conversations in your state's cultural sector. Just encourage you not to wait for the disaster to build the network, and that state arts agencies I think have a really special role to play. This network building is a fitting and potentially really powerful role. And we don't have to be the experts. We can just be the connectors. So thank you for your time. And thank you so much, Taiga. Eric, I will turn it back over to you to lead any questions, conversations.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Taiga. Yes, let's transition some Q&A time here. I've had a couple of questions come through. First one is for both of you from your perspective. You've brought together a number of people who don't necessarily work together in their day-to-day jobs. I think this connects up to that poll we just saw. Um, what was it in your mind that convinced those different sectors that they needed each other in this work? Um, Amy, why don't we start with you, and then Tyga, you can chime in as well.
I think of what Tyga was just mentioning, that when this was first kind of forming, it was kind of uh, an idea in Rachel Onoff's head initially, 2017, 2018, and she was showing up right at Vermont emergency management conferences. And at that time, people were like, what? Why are you here? So it's been, so to answer your question, Eric, I think it's been a lot of kind of conversations and understanding that takes time. And now I don't think there's as much question when the VACDaRN booth is at the Vermont Emergency Management Conference. I think that people are compelled and interested and able to get involved because one, it will make their lives easier. If they can come, if the Agency of Commerce and Community Development can see VACDaRN as the go-to for all the damage assessment reports that are happening in the arts and cultural sector, that makes life easier for them. And I cannot emphasize enough how much I am not a content expert on disaster resilience. I'm a cheerleader, I'm a hype man, and I can organize meetings, so hopefully we're doing that kind of convening work that makes it more possible for busy people from different sectors to participate. And yes, Sarah, we are going to be, Tyga and Rachel and I are all going to be in Kentucky for the Arts Disaster and Crisis Preparedness Conference. We're really looking forward to it.
Tyga, what do you think?
I mean, I agree with everything Amy has said. I think the one piece that I would add to it is some really stellar examples of arts organizations and entities offering really amazing resources in the aftermath of flooding, whether that was space for a volunteer center or a resource hub in, in some of our towns, which don't have a lot of large buildings and don't have a lot of large spaces. Um, or volunteer labor or just information of what was happening, that concrete example of seeing ways that the arts and culture sector showed up um, in a way that I think emergency management maybe hadn't imagined was possible and hadn't seen examples of until there was a really big flood.
I think I'll just say that I think it's not a coincidence that we saw in some of these very rural communities that some of the primary volunteer coordinators and community organizers in the aftermath of the flood were also arts leaders and artists. And I think that just kind of speaks to the transferable skills and overlap there.
Thank you both. I have a question that's, I think, a little bit similar to that one, but from a different angle. There are a lot of impressed by kind of this idea of bringing storytelling into the emergency managers, Tyga, and kind of the benefits that it sounds like you're seeing from that. Do either of you think that there are other opportunities for VACDaRN to kind of connect emergency management workers with the arts ahead of time to really kind of boost that shared perspective, create deeper connections? Is that something you've considered, or is that something that hasn't quite reached that stage yet?
I'm curious about Amy's thoughts. I think the Day of Learning was a great example of that. I was only present for one of them. I hadn't joined yet at the first one, but the ways that kind of showcased a lot of really creative ways of bringing the arts into everyday life, I think was a great step in the direction that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity to do more of that. I think that cross pollination, like we were saying before, the more that the emergency management world sees the things that the arts community does in the face of kind of preparedness and response, I think the more we're kind of cross pollinating and helping them kind of understand the opportunities there. Yeah, and I'm always interested in those ways that arts and culture is part of the solution. And those, like you were mentioning, Tyga, all the ways that different cultural organizations stepped up in their communities in a million different ways, and just the things that are already happening, but there's ways that we could encourage more of that to happen.
Yeah, I'd add to the sort of low-hanging fruit from my perspective because it's my day-to-day work is drill and exercise work with
Oh, yeah.
emergency response drill and exercise work is how I ended up in emergency management, how I ended up combining theater and my like former and still current life as a director with emergency management and emergency medical response. Um, we have a lot of agencies in town who do drills, do emergency preparedness drills, do patient care drills, do patient care practice scenarios, do statewide disaster drills of various kinds, and um, combining, bringing in, like offering the creative sector's imagination to that has made some of those so much more rich, whether that's this is a group of high school drama students who want to play your patients and get covered in fake blood for a day and have a great time. And will add so much more realism than a dummy would playing a patient, or than another firefighter who is not particularly interested in or doesn't have the time or energy to devote to learning how to be a good emotional actor. Um, those kinds of creative resources, I think, can be a huge asset to training, and that's one really concrete way that the emergency management and response sector, I think, can kind of get some insight into um, how they can benefit from those collaborations. So if that's of interest to any of the organizations within your network, offering that kind of collaboration, I think, can be a huge benefit to everyone, and it's a lot of fun.
Thank you both. I think we have time for a couple more short questions. I have one that's come across about the Resilient Cultural Organizations cohort, Amy. First, it's a two-parter. So, one, are you thinking about doing this again? Is this something you're planning on having another cohort in the future? And the second part of the question is, are you seeing benefits of bringing those group of cultural organizations together over that year beyond the preparedness aspects of it? Are you seeing new relationships and networks kind of come from that, or is that something you're hoping for?
Yeah, definitely. First question is this was a pilot. We had flood relief money to do this. And so we would very much, we learned a lot. We'd very much like to do it again with other different cohorts of the cultural sector. We'd love to do this, something similar with libraries. It's funding dependent, but we're hopeful to launch, to try this again in the next year or so. And yeah, we did in our assessment with this cohort that just wrapped up in June, overwhelmingly, this goes back to everything we've been saying today, overwhelmingly the benefit they got was the relationships, right? We had that D-plan tool, we had that risk assessment. That was an important formal structure for them to use and a really valuable tool for them to use together, but it was them using it together. Creating a disaster plan for a busy cultural organization is one of those like important but not urgent things that never gets done. And so that like mutual accountability of like, let's do our homework together and share this out with each other, that serves to build relationships, but it also, serves to like make it a priority when again it's you usually have a million other urgent things to do, but it kind of lifts it up on the priority list and makes it doable. So we found people, the respondents from that cohort definitely really valued that relationship building piece for sure.
Thank you. I have one final question. It's kind of a standard question for these type of web sessions. If for states who are just beginning or really feel like they need to ramp up their work in this sphere, what is one small practical step you could recommend they take to start building these relationships with emergency management or other partners, or just to move that work forward? Tyga, why don't we start with you this time?
I would say reach out to their town's emergency management director. At the state level, reach out to state emergency management, county if you have, but make that first communication with emergency management if you haven't already. And it can be as simple as this is what we have going on in the region that you cover, and this is what might be happening if an incident were to hit. And that information is so valuable to them, and that just opens the door to a conversation.
Thank you. Amy.
Yeah, I agree. learn that your state emergency management structure and make some outreach there.
Perfect. Well, that brings us to the end of our session. I just want to thank you again, Amy, Tyga. You're doing some great work there in Vermont. Thank you so much for sharing what you're doing and providing us some insight into how you came about getting this network together. I think it's going to be valuable for other folks out there.